What an episode. What a way to end season 1 on like the biggest cliffhanger ever. It was just the way it ended. It was like, oh my God, like I was so sure, like it felt like we were going to get a cliffhanger, right? Just because of the direction the show was going in, it felt like it could continue on for like another hour or like a whole nother series of events. And instead, it's just like Loki will return in season 2. And so now we know the entire plot behind season 2. But something that I want to get out of the way right now, the guy they were talking to, right? The guy that Jonathan Majors played in the show, that Sylvie and Loki were talking to, that was not Kang the Conqueror. Well, it was, but it wasn't. Let's talk about a guy called Immortus. So in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with regards to this explanation of this guy being a scientist from the 31st century, much of that is pretty much the exact same, except Kang the Conqueror originates from the 30th century in Marvel Comics. I don't really know why they chose 31st instead of 30th, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter all that much. Much like what you saw, the guy was just kind of living in his timeline, but Kang ultimately got bored with his life and discovered the ability to time travel. And so what he did in the comics is he traveled into the past to ancient Egypt and gave himself the name of Rama-Tut. Now, during this time, he faced off against characters like Apocalypse and he faced off against Doctor Strange, but most notably, he faced off against the Fantastic Four. And what the Fantastic Four ended up doing was in defeating him, basically forcing him back to his timeline. He was supposed to go back to the 30th century and then basically chalk up his attempts to go into the past as essentially a failure. Cast aside the name of Rama-Tut, go back to being Kang the Conqueror, that was supposed to be it. Instead, he ended up stopping in the modern era, facing off against some superheroes for a while, and then ended up in a realm called Limbo. Now, Limbo exists in two forms of Marvel Comics. There's the demonic realm of Limbo, then there is the actual realm of Limbo. The demonic realm of Limbo is the one that's ran by magic, also known as Ileana Rasputin. You may or may not see that in the MCU, I honestly have no idea, but the actual realm of Limbo is really what you think of when you think of Limbo, right? A purgatory-like place that exists outside of space and time. Now, for those of you guys who have been doing some reading outside of the Loki TV show, probably doing it online or watching my videos over at Comics Explained or whatever, you've probably heard of a giant city called Chronopolis and a castle of sorts in Chronopolis called Tenebrae. That's the realm of Immortus. The way this works is that when Rama-Tut traveled to Limbo, he looked throughout the time stream and saw that there were two possible futures for himself. The first is that he would go back to his life as Kang, and the second is that he would become an agent of the Timekeepers, and that in working for the Timekeepers, his job would be to ensure that he essentially pruned the timeline and made sure that they came into existence. He didn't like the idea of working for the Timekeepers, so he went back to being Kang, and then Kang went forward and did a whole bunch of other stuff across Marvel Comics. But there is an alternate universe where Rama-Tut stayed in Limbo and did become an agent of the Timekeepers, and that guy became Immortus. Now, Immortus's role in Marvel Comics was pretty simple. Unlike Kang the Conqueror, who basically traveled throughout the time stream and faced off against various people, Immortus largely just stayed in Limbo. We'll talk about why that matters here in a second. He had a few interesting stories here and there, things like the Celestial Madonna, the idea of Avengers Forever, and so on and so forth. But overall, the idea of Immortus was to look at the nature of Kang and to come to the realization that Kang was screwing up the time stream. So let's talk about Kang for a second. So if Immortus was a version of Kang who existed in Limbo and monitored what Kang Prime, as you can call him, was basically doing, then what Kang Prime was doing was running throughout the different points in the time stream. One of the things we covered in the video that we did here about the Multiverse Explained in regards to Marvel Comics here on Geek Culture Explained is we talked about the idea that traveling into the past is not enough to create an alternate reality in Marvel Comics. It's one of the big differences between the comics and the MCU. Just the very act of traveling into the past or anywhere into the time stream outside of where you're supposed to be is enough to create a branch universe in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So there's kind of a big difference there. But in order to actually create an alternate reality in Marvel Comics, you have to do a thing. So Kang the Conqueror could face off against the Avengers, and then a whole litany of alternate realities will basically emerge based on what possibilities could take place and how that fight with the Avengers could go. And so because Kang the Conqueror had done this on multiple occasions throughout the history of the time stream, it led to him creating a ton of alternate realities. And all these different alternate realities basically had different different versions of Kang that had different scenarios about them, some of whom destroyed the Avengers, some of whom got the Infinity Gauntlet and destroyed the universe or bent the universe to their whim, some of which conquered the entirety of their universe. But regardless of the situation, you had what was in effect a council of Kangs. Now, the Kangs themselves stretched on for a pretty lengthy amount of time, and much like what you saw in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the Loki show with the role of Immortus, which was coming to this realization that all these Kangs waging war against each other essentially would have resulted in the destruction of everything, that basically all the different Kangs were defeated. Immortus seemed to be the last man standing, and in doing so, created the TVA as a means to make sure that no other branch universes would emerge, and that in ensuring that's the case, no other Kangs would pop up. And so what you have here is a situation where Jonathan Majors is basically Immortus. The issue is that Jonathan Majors is now dead. He was killed by Sylvie, which means the multiverse is now just kind of going into full flux. And there's a few things that come out of this, right? But first and foremost, let's talk about what happened with Loki. So Loki himself was of course pushed through the portal by Sylvie and ended up in this place where when he went to meet with Mobius and B-15 and kind of this revelation of what was going on, they didn't remember who he was. The reason for that is because Loki's in an alternate reality, and we can deduce that he's in this alternate reality for a couple different reasons. One, we can say that he was inadvertently pushed into an alternate universe by Sylvie, or we can say that when Ravonna Renslayer basically went through her portal, that she ended up likely going into the past and changing things. Regardless of how you slice it, Loki's not in the same universe. Now let's say that Ravonna Renslayer went into the past and she altered things, right? She decided that she wanted to work with Kang the Conqueror as opposed to working for Kang the Conqueror, and is basically fulfilling her role as she exists in the comics and really just kind of being a love interest. Did you guys ever see the movie Deep Impact where that giant meteor crashed into the ocean and sent this giant tidal wave just careening in virtually every direction? That's how changes in the time stream work. In this instance, Ravonna Renslayer is potentially the asteroid hitting the water, and the changes to the time stream are the tidal wave moving towards its final destination. That's how this sort of thing works. It's a cascading effect. And so if Ravonna Renslayer went into the past and she decided to work with Kang once the multiverse was restored, and then in turn made it easier for a particular version of Kang to become this kind of person that basically found the TVA instead of Immortus, basically they won the multiversal war, then suddenly everything shifts and everything changes. That while the events more or less transpire the same throughout the history of the Loki show, it's Kang the Conqueror that you see as the statue at the end of the show instead of just a random timekeeper. The entire timeline has shifted. Now, let's say for example that what's actually going on here is that Loki was pushed into an alternate reality by Sylvie. How would this play out? How would it explain everything? Well, one, it makes things a lot easier. One of the things to understand when it comes to alternate realities in Marvel Comics, and by extension, at least to a degree, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is that everything in that universe before that point where it branches off stays the same. So say for example that you had an alternate reality where Peter Parker never became Spider-Man. Everything up to that point in that universe is still the same. It's just at that critical moment when Peter was supposed to be bitten by a radioactive spider, he went to the bathroom instead and was never bitten by that spider and then never became Spider-Man. Instead, maybe it was somebody like Gwen Stacy or Flash Thompson or something along those lines. Who really knows, who really cares? But everything up to that point is still the exact same. And so if Sylvie pushed Loki back to a point where he basically ended up in an alternate universe, it's easy to slide between one and the other if you have something like a portal. Maybe it's just one of these things where he was just kind of shoved in that direction, and that's basically it. We don't definitively know. It's just one of these things where it just kind of seems to have branched off. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you're in one of these finer little nexus points, it's easy for you to just kind of slide into an alternate reality without being able to keep yourself in the main universe. But there's all kinds of possibilities here. How the Marvel Cinematic Universe treats time travel is in a lot of ways different from how Marvel Comics handles it. It makes a lot more sense, which is certainly a much better thing. But at the end of the day, the Loki show was amazing. Like, it was absolutely awesome. Here's one of the funny things though. One of the big issues that a lot of people are struggling with is when Loki takes place. It's very easy for us to look at the Loki TV show and see that it comes after events like Avengers Endgame and Infinity War in terms of when Marvel created it. But just because of the fact that the movie was released after Infinity War does not mean it takes place after the events of Infinity War, that the TVA exists in null space, right? There's no time there. And so to impact the multiverse means to impact the entire timeline. And so look at WandaVision for a second, the post-credit scene, the idea that Wanda basically heard the voices of her kids and then took off after it to basically find out what was going on. It's entirely possible that her hearing that coincides with the creation of the multiverse, and that once the multiverse was formed, there's now an alternate reality out there where her kids basically survived. And that if we know somebody like Shuma Gorath in Doctor Strange 2 is going to be a major villain, and Shuma Gorath is aware of that, and given the history of his character, then he's aware of like Nexus beings like Wanda Maximoff, it wouldn't be that hard if he exists in the multiversal space to reach out to Wanda and trick her into believing that her kids are alive but in danger, and she has to go save them and then capture her, right? These are the kind of possibilities that can come out of the Loki TV show. These are the kind of things that you could be seeing. I don't know if we definitively will, but it is an awesome concept. Regardless, at the end of the day, the Loki show was amazing. I absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic show. I had a great time watching it, and I am very, very, very excited for season 2. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.